The emergency klaxon had been silent for 3 hours, but the smell of burnt wiring still hung in the air of the UES Relentless. Somewhere deep in the ship's lower decks, Bren Akaffer was using his bare hands to reroute a power conduit that had no business still functioning. It was functioning anyway. That was the thing about human ships. They had no right to keep going, and yet they did. Nobody told the Relentless this, so it kept going. 200,000 kilometers away, aboard the neutral station Halcyon Reach, 5 of the most powerful military minds in the known galaxy were sitting around a circular table and laughing. Not quietly, not politely, genuinely laughing. The schematics of Earth's warships were displayed on the main chamber screen. Grand Admiral Eurus Dale of the Talvari had called them up personally because he had heard rumors and had not believed them. Now he believed them and he found them funny. The hull plating alone was enough. It was thick. Not thick in the way modern warships used reinforced composite layers. Thick in the way a wall was thick. Solid. Heavy. The kind of material that added enormous mass to a vessel and slowed it down and served no strategic purpose in an age when every serious navy in the galaxy used energy shielding. Human ships had no energy shielding. Admiral Soren Yeth of the Mechari pulled up the technical breakdown on his personal display and read the specifications twice, because the first time he assumed there had been a translation error. There was no translation error. The humans had simply decided, apparently as a matter of policy, to build their warships the same way a primitive civilization might build a fortified wall. Layer after layer of physical material. Redundant mechanical systems that had been obsolete for centuries. Manual override options on nearly every critical function, as though they expected their automated systems to fail regularly and wanted to be ready for it. Yeth was a data man. He ran the numbers. A Relentless-class vessel in direct engagement against any mid-tier warship in any of the 5 fleets represented at this table would last, statistically, approximately 11 minutes. That was being generous. Admiral von Rye of the Cressali was the one who made the joke. She said it looked like the humans had built their warships the same way they built furniture. Just pile on more material until it holds together. She said it with a smile and a wave of her hand, and the chamber laughed again, and the sound of it filled the room. At the observers' table, set slightly apart from the main circle as a reminder that humanity had not earned a real seat yet, Fleet Admiral Petra Harlow wrote something in her notebook. Nobody could see what it was. Her face was completely still. The conclave of shared stars met every 10 years. It was not a friendly gathering. The 5 powers represented here had fought each other across centuries and had signed enough peace agreements to paper a planet. But they had found it useful to talk, to share certain intelligence, to draw certain lines. This cycle, for the first time, they had agreed to allow a human observer, not a participant, an observer. It was considered a gesture of goodwill toward a species that had, admirably, managed to build working faster-than-light drives and leave their own solar system, without immediately destroying anything important. That goodwill had lasted approximately 4 minutes into the fleet review session. Brecaloz of the Dorathi was quieter than the others. His people were warriors in the oldest sense. They had built their civilization around the idea that a fight was the most honest conversation 2 beings could have. He did not laugh as loudly as von Rye. He looked at the schematics and felt something he could not immediately name. Something about the design bothered him in a way he did not fully understand yet. He kept looking at the manual override specifications. You did not build that many manual fallbacks unless you expected to use them. And you did not expect to use them unless your people had been in enough situations where everything had already gone wrong. He filed the thought away and said nothing. Ora Neen of the Sylvani had stopped laughing before the others. She was watching Harlow. The human woman had not reacted to any of it, not the jokes, not the laughter, not the casual dismissal of everything her people had built. She was just writing in that notebook with a calm, steady hand. Ora Neen had negotiated with a lot of species over her career. She had learned, slowly and sometimes painfully, that the most dangerous thing you could encounter across a table was someone who already knew how the meeting was going to end. Harlow looked like someone who already knew how the meeting was going to end. The session moved on. Humanity's fleet numbers were entered into the official record as a minor notation. The 5 admirals turned to more serious matters: the Mekari border situation, the Krasali trade disputes, the ongoing question of Durathi expansion into the Outer Rim. Human warships were not brought up again. Outside in the cold dark between the stars, the Relentless kept moving. Akafar finished the conduit reroute, wiped his hands on his uniform, and went to find something to eat. The ship was fine. It was always fine. That was the job. The signal came in on a frequency that nobody monitored anymore. That was the first strange thing. The automated distress relay buried in the Vethara debris belt had been installed 80 years ago, during a war that most of the galaxy had since reclassified as a footnote. The station's systems flagged it, routed it to a junior communications officer, and the junior communications officer stared at it for a full minute before deciding it was above her pay grade. She forwarded it to her supervisor. Her supervisor forwarded it to the duty officer. The duty officer put it on the secondary screen in the main chamber, where it sat for 11 minutes before anyone looked at it. It was human. A ship designator, a position fix, and a single line of status text. Hull breach contained. Propulsion at 40%, medical priority 11 personnel, requesting docking clearance. No drama. No distress in the voice, just data. Whatever had happened out in that debris field, whoever was sending this signal had already handled the panic part and moved on to the logistics. Oranine noticed it first. She was always watching the secondary screens. Old habit. She read the coordinates and pulled up the charts without saying anything to the others. The Vethara debris belt was not on any standard transit route. It was not near anything. It was a graveyard that the war had created and the decades had left alone. There was no reason for a human ship to be anywhere near it. No civilian reason, anyway. She kept that thought to herself and watched the others. The main session had moved into a discussion of Krasali trade licensing, which Von Rye was dominating with characteristic confidence. Eurus Dale was listening with the patience of someone who had heard this argument many times before. Yeth was making notes. Brekka Lowe's appeared to be paying attention, but his eyes drifted to the secondary screen once, then again, then stayed. He leaned over to his aide and said something quietly. His aide pulled up the long-range sensor feed for the debris belt. There was a ship there. Even at this distance, the silhouette was readable, blocky, heavy, moving slowly, one engine cluster dark. The hull scoring was visible as a pattern of discoloration across the port side, the kind of marking you got from sustained weapons fire across an extended engagement. Not a lucky hit, not a mine strike. Someone had been shooting at this ship for a long time. Brekka Lowe's said nothing. He moved the sensor feed to his personal display and kept watching. Yeth noticed what Breck was looking at and pulled the data himself. He ran an automated damage assessment. The program returned results that it flagged as anomalous and asked for confirmation before displaying, because the gap between estimated damage and current operational status was outside normal parameters. Yeth confirmed. He read the assessment. He read it again. By the model's calculations, a ship with that level of structural damage should not be moving under its own power. The port engine cluster was gone, not damaged, gone. 2 secondary systems showed as completely offline. There were hull breaches in 3 sections, all apparently sealed. The power signature was irregular, jumping between readings in a way that suggested the main distribution system was damaged but functional, running on something it was not supposed to be running on. And yet the ship was moving, slow and deliberate, picking its way through the debris field with steady course corrections, navigating around the dead hulks of 80-year-old wreckage without any apparent difficulty. Von Rye finally noticed that 2 of the admirals were no longer paying attention to her. She followed their gaze to Breck's display and raised an eyebrow. "The human ship," she said. "It limps home. This is not interesting." Breck did not answer. Harlow, at the observer's table, had also been watching the sensor feed. She closed her notebook. She looked at the display for a moment with an expression that was not quite a smile and not quite anything else. Then she looked back at the table and was still. She had not told them what the Relentless was doing in the debris belt. She had not told them anything. The Conclave had not asked, because the Conclave had not considered until approximately 3 minutes ago that it needed to. The station's automated system opened a comm channel to the incoming vessel as standard protocol. For a moment there was nothing. Then a voice came through, even, unhurried, carrying the faint background noise of a working ship. "Halcyon Reach, this is Captain Rael Dorn of the UES Relentless. We are requesting docking clearance on medical priority. 11 wounded, none critical. We will need a repair bay if one is available, but it is not urgent. Please advise on approach corridor." That was it. No explanation, no context, no mention of where they had been or what had happened to them. Orenine wrote one line in her private log: "Find out what that ship was doing out there before anyone else does." She was already 3 minutes behind. The scout reached the debris belt in 52 minutes and began transmitting immediately. Nobody in the conclave chamber was talking about trade licensing anymore. The feed came through on the main display, the one they used for formal presentations, the big one that everyone had to look at. The duty officer had routed it there without asking permission, which was technically a breach of protocol, but nobody said anything because everyone was already looking. The debris belt was exactly what it had always been, a slow-drifting graveyard of hulls from a war that the galaxy had mostly forgotten. Old wreckage, ancient damage, the kind of destruction that time had already started to swallow, edges blurring, metal oxidizing in the faint particulate of deep space. Except for the new wreckage. 3 ships, large ones, still warm on the thermal scan, which meant they had not been dead long hours, not days. The scout circled the first one, and the camera gave them a clear look at what was left. The hull was split along the midsection, a catastrophic structural failure from inside, which meant the kill had not come from a single clean shot. It had come from sustained damage that had finally found a critical point and pushed through it. The registry markings were still visible on the aft section. Yeth's aide ran them before Yeth could ask. The results came back in under a minute, and the aide did not read them aloud. He simply turned his display so Yeth could see. Razoth Syndicate. The chamber was very quiet. The Razoth Syndicate was not a small operation. They were a mercenary and raiding organization that had been operating in the outer regions for 40 years, and 2 of the powers sitting at this table had benefited from their activities in ways that had never been made explicit in any official document. Everybody knew. Nobody said it. The Syndicate used real warships, converted military vessels, properly armed, crewed by experienced fighters. These 3 ships were converted cruisers. Each one was larger than the Relentless. Each one outgunned it by any standard measure. The scout moved to the second wreck. Same story. Hull failures consistent with a prolonged engagement, not a single devastating blow. Whatever had killed these ships had done it the hard way, grinding, sustained, refusing to stop. Brecalow stood up. He was not a man who stood up during sessions. He considered it undignified. He stood up now and walked closer to the main display because he wanted to see better. He looked at the debris pattern. He had been a tactician before he had been an admiral, and the debris told a story if you knew how to read it. The Relentless had been moving when it fought. It had not held position. It had kept moving, kept changing its angle, made itself harder to hit at the cost of making its own shots harder to land. That was not the tactic of a ship that was confident it could win. It was the tactic of a ship that knew it could take more damage than the other side expected and was planning to use that. 3 cruisers, 1 Relentless-class human vessel, and the Relentless was the one that had limped away. Von Rye sat with her hands flat on the table and her eyes fixed on the screen, and she did not say anything. The furniture joke from 2 days ago had not left the room. She could feel it sitting there, and she could feel the difference between what she had said and what she was currently looking at. Eurus Dale was the oldest person in the chamber. He had seen a lot of battles and he had read a lot of after-action reconstructions, and he understood what the debris field was telling him. What he could not understand, what genuinely did not fit into any framework he had, was the crew. A Talvari vessel that took that level of damage mid-engagement would have initiated emergency withdrawal protocols. It was not cowardice. It was doctrine. You did not win a war by losing ships. You pulled back, you regrouped, you came back with more force. Every serious navy in the galaxy operated on this principle. The Relentless had not pulled back. It had kept fighting through damage that should have triggered 3 separate automatic withdrawal systems, which meant either the automatic withdrawal systems had failed or someone had overridden them. He thought about that for a moment. Then he thought about all those manual override options in the schematics they had laughed at 2 days ago. Oranine had already sent her aide out of the room with a message to her government. She was now watching Harlow. The human admiral was sitting at the observer's table with the same stillness she had carried into every session. She was not watching the screen. She was looking at her hands. She already knew. She had known when the distress signal came in. She had said nothing and let them find it themselves, and now they had found it, and the chamber was full of a silence that tasted very different from the laughter of 2 days ago. The scout completed its sweep and filed its report. 3 destroyed vessels. Crew count on all 3, 412 personnel. No survivors found. 1 battered human ship, 11 wounded, none critical. Yeth closed his statistical model. He opened a new one. Rael Dorn had grease on his left sleeve when he walked into the conclave chamber. He had noticed it in the corridor outside and decided it did not matter. He was here to answer questions, not to impress anyone, and the Relentless still had 17 open work orders that needed his attention before they could think about jumping home. He sat down at the briefing table without waiting to be invited. His engineer, Bren Akaffer, sat beside him. Neither of them spoke first. They were waiting, the way people wait when they have nowhere else to be. Harlow at the observer's table said nothing. This was Rael's briefing. She was just watching. Eurus Dale opened by asking Rael to describe the engagement in the debris field. Not his orders, not his mission context, just the engagement. Rael nodded and started talking. He had been on a standard survey run through the outer belt, mapping residual radiation from the old war for an academic study his ship had been tasked to support. 3 days into it, his long-range sensors had picked up a convoy of civilian haulers on the edge of the belt, running a routine ore transfer. Standard traffic. Nothing unusual. Then his tactical officer, Lieutenant Sora Vance, had flagged something. 3 signatures running dark on the far side of the belt, positioned in a spread formation that did not make sense for any civilian purpose. The positioning was clean, professional. It was an ambush setup. He had tried to raise the convoy. No response. The syndicate ships were already jamming the channel. He had tried to raise Halcyon Reach. Too far, too much interference from the belt. He had 2 options: leave and get help, in which case the convoy would be dead before any help arrived, or engage. He had engaged. Yeth interrupted at this point. He asked carefully whether Rael had understood he was facing 3 cruiser-class vessels. Rael said yes. Yeth asked how he had assessed his probability of success. Rael thought about this for a moment, not because he did not know the answer, but because he seemed to be choosing how to say it accurately. He said he had not assessed his probability of success. He had assessed his probability of making the engagement expensive enough that the convoy could break the jamming and run. That was the goal. Survive long enough to change the math for the civilian ships. Whether the Relentless survived was a secondary consideration. The chamber was quiet. Akaffer, who had not been asked anything yet, added something without prompting. He said that this was why the ship was built the way it was. Not because humans did not understand shielding technology. They understood it fine. They had made a different choice. Energy shields were excellent at stopping the first engagement, the clean engagement, the engagement that went the way you planned. But shields failed under sustained fire, and when they failed, if that was all you had, the ship died. Human ships were built for the engagement that did not go the way you planned. Every system had a manual fallback because someone had decided, somewhere early in human spacefaring, that they were going to design for the worst moment, not the average moment. Von Rye asked a question she had clearly been sitting on for some time. She asked about the crew. How do you keep people fighting when the ship is that badly damaged? It was not quite a tactical question. It was something else. Rail looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "The crew of the Relentless knew what would happen to the convoy if they stopped. That was enough. People do not need to believe they are going to survive. They need to believe what they are doing matters. Those are different things, and humans have generally found the second one easier to hold onto than the first." Brecalows made a sound that was not quite a word. In Durathi culture, it was the sound you made when someone said something true that you had known for a long time but had not heard said plainly before. Dale asked one more question. He asked whether the Relentless had been in situations like this before. Rail said yes. Dale asked how many times. Rail thought about it and said he would have to check the ship's log for an exact count, but it was not a small number. Dale asked if every human warship crew had this kind of experience. Rail said he could not speak for every crew, but the training was the same. They all trained for the ship half dead and still moving. They all trained for the moment after everything had failed. That was just the standard. Akafar said more quietly that it was also the reason human crews were larger than most navies considered necessary for a ship of that size. More hands for damage control. More people to seal a breach or reroute a conduit or carry a wounded crewmate away from a fire. Ships could be rebuilt. Trained crew took years. Nobody laughed. Rail stood up after an hour, said he had appreciated the opportunity to answer their questions, and asked if there was anything else they needed before he got back to his repair schedule. There was not. He nodded once to the room, the same way you nod to a person you have just finished having a reasonable conversation with, and left. Akefir followed him out. The chamber stayed quiet for a long time. That night, on a station full of diplomats and soldiers and staff officers with very full schedules, none of the 5 admirals slept well. Eurus Dale sat in his quarters with the lights low and did not read, did not review documents, did not do any of the things he normally did when sleep would not come. He just sat. He was old enough to remember the last time his people had been in a war that genuinely threatened their survival, not a border conflict, not a resource dispute, a real war, the kind where you started losing planets and did not know where it would stop. He had been young then, and he had watched his people's finest warships perform exactly as designed until the enemy adapted. And then the shields had started failing. And then the losses had become something nobody discussed at briefings anymore because the numbers were too hard to look at. He had always believed it was a new shielding technology that had turned the war. Better energy barriers, developed in the final year when they were most desperate. That was the official history. He was sitting here at the end of his career, wondering whether the real difference had been something much simpler. The crews who had survived those final battles were not the ones with the best equipment. They were the ones who had kept fighting after the equipment stopped working. He had always thought of that as luck, or stubbornness, or something particular to certain commanders. He had never thought of it as something you could build a doctrine around on purpose. Apparently you could. Soren Yeth did not sit in the dark. He sat at his desk with every light on and worked through the problem the way he worked through every problem, systematically, from first principles. His statistical models for combat outcomes were among the best in the Mechari fleet. He had used them to plan engagements, secure funding, advise governments. He trusted them the way other people trusted gravity. The engagement in the debris belt had broken them. Not in a small way, in a foundational way. When he dug down into the assumptions his models were built on, he found the problem quickly. He had modeled crew as a constant. a fixed efficiency value that degraded predictably as damage accumulated. Every navy he had ever studied showed the same pattern. As a ship took more damage, crew performance dropped, systems failed faster, decision quality declined. It was reliable enough to be mathematical. Human crew did not match this curve. The relentless data showed something that looked statistically like the opposite. As the situation became more desperate, something in the crew response had sharpened rather than degraded. He had no explanation for this. He had no category for it. He wrote in his private log, "Current models treat crew as equipment. This may be the error. Reanalysis required. All of it." He underlined all of it twice. Von Rye stood at the observation window in her quarters and looked out at the dock, relentless for a long time. Her people valued elegance. In art, in diplomacy, in warfare, the Cresali philosophy was that the best solution was always the most efficient one, the one that used the least force to achieve the greatest result. It was an aesthetic as much as a strategy, and she had built her entire career around it. The relentless was not elegant. It was the opposite of elegant. It was thick and heavy and slow, and designed with a redundancy that her people would have called wasteful. The philosophy it represented was not find the clean solution. It was survive long enough that the clean solution becomes available. She found it almost offensive. She also could not stop looking at the hull scoring. She had fought in 4 engagements in her career. She knew what sustained fire looked like on a hull. The Relentless had been hit more times in one engagement than some ships saw in an entire deployment, and it had come out of the debris field on its own power and asked, calmly, for a docking bay and 11 medical beds. She had made a joke about furniture. The Relentless had fought 3 cruisers. She went to bed without resolving the feeling that was sitting somewhere between admiration and embarrassment. Brecalose did not go back to his quarters at all. He went to the medical bay. He was not sure why. He told himself he was following up on the syndicate wreck, which was technically his business since the Dorathi had their own complicated history with that organization. But what he actually did, when he got there, was find Lieutenant Sara Vance sitting up in a medical bed with a bandaged shoulder, reviewing tactical logs on a handheld screen. He pulled up a chair and sat down. She looked at him without surprise, which he respected. They talked for 2 hours, not about politics, not about the conclave, about the engagement. She walked him through every decision point, why she had called certain shots, how the target priority had shifted as the damage accumulated, what she had been thinking when the port sensor array had gone down and she had switched to manual calculation for targeting. She was precise and direct and completely uninterested in impressing him. He told her the Dorathi word for a soldier who you would stand beside in a fight. She did not know the word. He told her what it meant. She nodded and went back to her logs. He sat there a while longer and then walked back to his quarters and slept fine, which was unusual. Oranine had already sent her memo hours ago. She was done processing. She was planning. The last day of the conclave began with a small thing that nobody commented on. When Petra Harlow entered the main chamber for the final session, Eurus Dale stood up. Not much, just a few centimeters. The kind of thing you do without deciding to, the kind of thing that happens when your body responds to something before your mind has caught up. He noticed what he was doing, and he did not sit back down until Harlow had taken her seat. She did not acknowledge it. He did not draw attention to it, but Oranine saw it, and she understood what it meant. The formal business came first. A border adjustment resolution, some trade language, a mutual intelligence protocol that had been argued over for 3 sessions. The 5 admirals handled all of it efficiently. The conclave was nearly done. The last item on the agenda was the vote on human observer status, the same courtesy vote that had always been expected to take 2 minutes and mean nothing. Harlow asked to speak before the vote. She was given 3 minutes. She did not use 3 minutes, she used less. She did not talk about the Relentless. She did not bring up the debris field or the 3 destroyed cruisers or any of the details they all already knew. She talked about something else. She said, "Humanity has been in difficult situations before. Not in space, on the ground, on one planet, long before faster-than-light travel was a concept anyone had thought seriously about. She said that her people had a pattern that she could not fully explain and was not going to try to make sound more impressive than it was. The pattern was this: when things went wrong, humans tended to stay. They built walls that were too thick because they did not trust that nothing would get through. They put in a second door because the first one might fail. They kept one person in the room who knew how to do everything manually because the automated system might one day stop. She said this was not cleverness. It was not a strategy anyone had designed on purpose. It was just what happened when a species spent enough time in situations where the alternative to staying was something worse. She said, "We are not asking for your trust. We are not asking for your admiration. We are here, we intend to keep being here, and we will be the same people in 100 years that we are right now." She sat down. The vote was unanimous. What happened after the vote was not recorded in the official conclave minutes. It was a series of small things, the kind that happen when a formal event is over, and people are just people for a few minutes before they go back to being admirals and diplomats. Brecca Lowe's crossed the chamber and stopped in front of Harlow. He said one word in Darathi. She did not know the word. He translated it. It meant, roughly, someone worth having on your side when the situation is bad. He said it was the highest thing his people said about a soldier. He said it without ceremony, the way you say something true. She thanked him. Yeth gave her a data chip. He said it contained the revised version of the Mechari combat projection model, the one he had rebuilt overnight to account for human crew variants. He said she was welcome to it. He said it was more accurate now, and that he found it mildly embarrassing that it had taken this long to fix. She said she appreciated the honesty. He nodded and left. Von Rye stopped beside her for just a moment. She did not give anything or say anything of significance. She looked at Harlow directly and said, "I made a joke earlier this week." Harlow said she remembered. Von Rye said nothing else and walked out. It was not an apology. It was something more honest than an apology. It was an acknowledgement which cost more. Oranine was last. She sat down beside Harlow and spoke quietly, not for the room. She said, "I sent a message to my government 2 days ago. She said she would not share the full contents, but she would tell Harlow the last line. The last line was, 'Do not make an enemy of these people, not because they are powerful, but because they will not stop, and there is a difference between those two things that our war colleges have not taught us to measure yet.'" Harlow looked at her for a moment. Then she said, "I hope they listen." Oranine said, "So do I." Outside in the docking bay, the Relentless was ready to go. Akafer had certified all systems. Vance had plotted the course. Rail had signed off on 17 completed work orders and 3 that were still in progress, which he filed under acceptable. The crew was aboard. The hull was still scarred. There had not been time or resources for a full repair, and Rail had not asked for either. The ship undocked cleanly, turned toward the jump corridor, and moved. On the observation deck of Halcyon Reach, a number of people had gathered at the windows to watch it go. Personnel from different fleets, different species, different flags. Nobody had organized this. They had just arrived, one by one, and stood there. The Relentless did not slow down or make any gesture toward the station. The crew had a lot of work still to do, and a long way to go, and no particular interest in being watched. They were already looking at the charts. The ship jumped. The window showed empty space. Nobody left the observation deck immediately.